Truth Triumphant by B.J. Wilkinson. Chapter 17, Abba and the Church in Persia. In the 6th century, according to the report of an Nestorian traveler, Christianity was successfully preached to the Bactrians, the Huns, the Persians, the Indians, the Parsimenians, and the Medes and the Elamites. The barbaric churches, from the Gulf of Persia to the Caspian Sea, were almost infinite. The zeal of the Nestorians overleaped the limit which had confined the ambition and curiosity of both the Greeks and Persians. The missionaries of Balkh and of Samarkand pursued without fear the footsteps of the roving Tartar. In their progress by sea and land, the Nestorians entered China by the port of Canton. Prominent among the dauntless leaders who spread the faith from the Tigris eastward is Alba, A.D. 500 to 575. He is identified with that great church which has been called the Waldenses of the East. For centuries, the followers of Jesus in Asia were generally called Messians, or Messiah people. Many renowned Messians who withstood the fierce opposition of the Persian state religion, or Mithraism, carried primitive Christianity to India, Central Asia, China, and Japan. Outstanding among them was Alba. If the victory of Christianity over Mithraism in the Roman Empire was a European triumph, the victory of the church in the wilderness over this counterfeit in Persia is still more outstanding. Mithraism was proud not only of her sway in Persia, but also of having adapted Zoroastrianism to the Western world, thus having paved the way for this form of sun worship to become a universal religion in the Roman Empire. The 2 centuries and a half spanned the time between Pappus in 285, the first Catholicos, or supreme head of the Church of the East, to the Catholicos Abba, A.D. 538, were alternating years of peace and persecution. One must recall that the supreme head of the Church of the East was called Catholicos, and his incumbency area was a Catholicate. A former chapter related how in this same year the papacy was securely seated in the city of Rome. During the intervening decades, there were many bright luminaries leading lights over the Assyrian church to guide the faithful. Some of these sealed their witnessing with their blood. Persia at war with Rome naturally spelled persecution. The Persian commanders-in-chief did not distinguish between papal Christianity of persecution, the papal Christianity of the Roman Empire, and the Church of the Messiah. All Christians were alike to them, whether the believers were of Persia or of Rome. The Iranian lords feared collusion between the Persian evangelicals and Rome, and also suspected the existence of spies. Moreover, Mithraism sought to secure any position to attack the simple but ever-expanding church in the wilderness. The sun was sacred to Mithraism. Persecutions fell upon the believers who lived and worked in the presence of sun worshippers, and the Christians dared not say that the sun was not a living being. Mithraism imitated Bible ceremonies. The Church of Rome, which, according to some authorities had imbibed much of the lure and philosophy of Mithraism, was very near to it in spirit. The Christians in Persia refused to the sublimated, exalted idolatry of the Iranians, and suffered because they did so. The first persecution of magnitude after the union of all districts of the Church of the East under Pappus was launched by the Persian king Shapur II. It began during the Catholicate of the Shinmun Simeon and continued through 40 years, from A.D. 335 to A.D. 375. King Shapur was ambitious to recover all the territories ruled over by King Xerxes of the early Persian Empire. He launched his attack as soon as he deemed the time favorable. But the church members refused to serve in the army, and the exasperation of the king knew no bounds. He was enraged not only at the defeat of his campaign, but also because of the courageous defenders in the great fortress of Nisibis had withstood his attacks and had been kept alive by James, the resident bishop appointed by the Church of Rome. On his return to Seleucia, the capital, the king determined to exact retribution from the Persian Christians. The Mobids, or priests of Magianism, were at hand to arouse the wrath of the king. The first Firman decree of persecution laid a double tax upon the Messians to defray the expenses of the war. Shimun, the Catholicos, was ordered to collect it. He refused on the grounds of religious scruples and because of the poverty of his people. Though Shimun was a personal friend of the king, nothing now was to stand in the way of teaching the Christian lesson. The Christians a lesson. The destruction of church buildings throughout the empire was commanded, and the Catholicos were arrested. He was offered freedom for himself and his people if he would adore the sun but once. Upon his refusal, he, with 5 associates over districts and 100 another clergy, were put to death. 40 years of trial by fire now descended upon the children of God. Provincial governors had the power to condemn or acquit. In the case of a kind and just governor, the church fared well, but such was usually not the situation. The popular complaints, sufficient to keep alive the resentment against the Christians, would run over something like this. They despise our sun god. Did not Zoroaster, the sainted founder of our divine beliefs, institute Sunday 1,000 years ago to honor of the sun and to supplant the Sabbath of the Old Testament, with the Jews in our land then sanctified? Yet these Christians have divine services on Sunday. They desecrate the sacred earth by burying their dead in it and pollute the water by their ablutions. They refuse to go to war for the Shah, and they preach that snakes, scorpions, and creeping things were created by a good God. The intention of Shapur II to deal effectively with the followers of the New Testament did not stop with the death of Shimun. The next Catholicos, elected as his successor, followed him to a martyr's grave, and when another head of the church was chosen, he also was put to death. The office remained vacant for 20 years. Naturally, the main objects of attack were the clergy, but the bitterest feelings were displayed against the converts from Magianism. While it was true that the church in the East did not have monasteries in the sense of the celibate life which had spread over Egypt and Europe, nevertheless, there arose those who believed that they could work more effectively by remaining single. Those who had lived for many generations in a nation of liberty and light can little appreciate the desperate opposition which the heralds of the cross met in different lands throughout the early centuries. In the East, Christianity encountered Buddhism, a religion carried on largely by monks and nuns. To cope with such powerful antagonists as Buddhism, Zoroastrianism, there were those who naturally felt that they could do it more effectively by not marrying. Advocacy of an unmarried clergy had never been the ascendancy of the Church of the East. Such houses of a celibate life would not have been able to endure in Persia. The persecution was bitter enough against the Eastern theological training centers, and it was furious against unmarried clergy. The Mithraic faith was strong in advocating marriage and presenting children to the state who could serve in the army and be of other service. After the death of Shapur II, there was a lull for a time in the sufferings of the church. Finally, the believers gathered up strength to elect another head. Then the Catholicos and the leading clergy took advantage of the time of peace to reorganize the church. There was now a greater demand for a strong reorganization, for persecution had fired the zeal of the believers. Many of the oppressed had fled eastward to other lands, there to found new churches. It was not long, however, until in the subsequent reigns of Yazdegerd I, Bahrain V, and Yazdegerd II, waves of death and destruction swept over the Persian believers. These were not as long as under Shapur II, but they were much more severe. The facts concerning the outbreak of persecution under Yazdegerd I, the first of these kings, was given by de Lacy O'Leary. The Persian bishop of Susa, who was given to impetuosity and impulsiveness, destroyed one of the fire temples of the Zoroastrians. Complaint being made by the king, the bishop was ordered to restore the building and make good all the damages that had been done. When the bishop refused, Yazdegerd I threatened to destroy every church in his dominion. Such orders were issued and were carried out eagerly by the Zoroastrians, inflamed with jealousy against the believers. Before long, the destruction of the churches developed into a general persecution. Yazdegerd I died in AD 420, and his son Bahram V increased the afflictions of the church. Clergy and laity alike were subjected to the most horrible tortures. Their feet were bored with sharp irons, and some experienced what is called the 9 deaths, where bit by bit their bodies were cut to pieces. It was quite common under the different monarchs to confiscate the wealth of the well-to-do and to pillage their homes. Had there been no state Christianity in the Roman Empire, probably in Persia there could not have been the persecutions of Christianity. Zeno, the Roman Emperor, closed the Assyrian Church College at Edessa because it did not agree. Closed the Assyrian Church College at Edessa because it did not agree with the theological views then prevailing in the state religion. A powerful leader in the Church of the East moved the school to Nisibis, a strong fortress city in which the college developed into one of the intellectual centers of the world. The phenomenal work and influence of the new college at Nisibis, opened by Barsumas, reached to Oxford, Cambridge, and Paris. Thus, W. H. Wigram writes, "When we remember how much of the culture of medieval Europe has come to her through the Saracens, that the Nestorians were the teachers of the Saracens, one is set asking whether Oxford, Cambridge, and Paris do not owe an unsuspected debt to Barsoma through the road to Nisibis. To the centers may run through Baghdad and Salmananka." Persia later became tolerant of Christianity. Liberty was increased there while it was vanishing in Europe. If Mohammedanism had not conquered Persia, the Christians probably would have gained complete religious liberty. Persian Christians escape theology of Rome. The Christianity of Persia existed not only as a challenge to Mithraism, but also it differed widely from the ruling church of the Roman Empire. The 40 years of persecution by Shapur II made impossible any contact between the believers and the two dominions. The revolutionary events which centered in the Council of Nicaea and in the angry controversies which followed that gathering were unknown to the churches beyond the Euphrates. They had no part in the fierce disputes concerning the Godhead. They had grown in strength and had performed miracles in spreading the gospel eastward before the contest arose over Nestorius. Nestorianism, according to Samuel Edgar, is a dispute about words. It is a misnomer to call the Church of the East Nestorian. Even to this day, communions so labeled resent the name. The Church of the East in India also was free from the controversies of imperial Christianity. This fact reveals the separation between the Church of India and the Western hierarchy. To note some of the differences between the Church of the East and the papacy, it may be observed that the first rejected the use of images, and interposed no mediator like the Virgin Mary between God and man. The Church of the East also dispensed with candles, incense, relics, and many of other usages of imperial Christianity. They had a different Bible than that of Rome. For their Bibles, they used the Peshitta, evidently the work of the school of Lucian. Assyrian Christians, the names often given to the Church of the East, rejected the supremacy of the Bishop of Rome. At this time, Seleucia, the church headquarters, was full of Jews, and many Christians throughout the East were of Jewish blood. Of the Persian Christians, W. F. Edeni writes, "They have no doctrine of transubstantiation, no purgatory. They do not sanction mariolatry or the image worship, nor will they even allow icons to be exhibited in their churches. Men and women take the communion in both kinds. All 5 orders of the clergy below the bishops are permitted to marry." Missionary expansion from Papist to Abba. In the early Christian centuries, there was a system of roads and posts between cities of Central Asian plains, as lately shown by the recovery of documents in some of the unearthed cities. And there was no pass unknown to the Chinese pilgrims, not only the direct routes, but all ways which linked up with the Buddhist centers. When the Persian king Kawad in AD 498, because of rebellion in his kingdom, twice took refuge with the Huns and the Turks, he found Christians there who helped him to reconquer his lands. When he had regained the throne, he killed some of the Mithridates, incarcerated others, but was benevolent towards the Christians, because a company of them had rendered service to him on his way to the king of the Turks. About this same time, the Assyrian Christians were credited with having taught the Turks the art of writing in their own language. In commenting upon their expansion eastward, Wigram indicates their influence over Tibet. The 7th century was a period of missions to China, and the strangely Christian-like ceremonial of modern lamas is quite possibly borrowed from the Assyrian sources. The scholar Alexander von Humboldt reveals how thorough were the education and organization of the Church of the East before Abba. He shows how this same church taught arts and sciences to the Arabs. It was ordained in this wonderful decrees by which the course of events is regulated, that the Christian sects of the Nestorians, which exercised a very marked influence on the geographical diffusion of knowledge, should prove of use to the Arabs, even before they advanced to the erudite, learned, and contentious argumentative city of Alexandria, and that protected by the armed followers of the creed of Islam. These Nestorian doctrines of Christianity were enabled to penetrate far into Eastern Asia. The Arabs were first made acquainted with the Greek literature through the Syrians, a kindred Semitic race, who had themselves acquired a knowledge of it only about 150 years earlier through the heretical Nestorians. Physicians who had been educated in the scholastic establishment of the Greeks and in the celebrated school of the medicine founded by the Nestorian Christians at Edessa in Mesopotamia, were settled at Mecca as early as Muhammad's time, and there lived on a footing of friendly intercourse with the Prophet and Abu Bakr. In AD 549, the White Huns inhabiting the regions of Bactria, and the Huns on both the north and the south banks of the Oxus River, sent a request to Persia to the Catholicos Abba that he would ordain for them a director. The Persian king was astonished to see these representatives of the thousands of Christians in that distant land coming to him, and being amazed at the power of Jesus, he concurred. The spiritual director was ordained, and he returned with the mission. A. Mingana gives a list of 21 towns and provinces west of the Oxus River which had spiritual leaders ordained to rule the churches in them, and mentions especially those leaders in the 5th and 6th centuries. He also maintains that the majority of those two powerful divisions of the Eastern Turks, the Uyghurs and the Karaites, were Christians, and that the gospel of Christ had penetrated into the mighty confederacy of the Namians, composed of 9 powerful clans. These missionaries had also converted a 4th conglomeration of tribes of the Turkish stock with an infusion of Mongolian blood, called the Merkits. All these vigorous people lived far away to the northeast in Asia. As to supplementary records of this expansion, Mrs. E. A. Gordon says, Dr. Ariel Stein recently discovered in the Loess deposit of wind-borne clay and soil in the Chinese Turkestan thousands of rolls of precious manuscripts. Claudian Buchanan, who has left a thrilling account of his own experiences and life in India about AD 1812, declares that he saw in that land a Syrian version of the Bible, which, according to popular belief, would date probably as far back to AD 325, the year of the Council of Nicaea. There is no doubt that the fierce 40-year persecution of King Sapur of Persia hurried many Christians away into India. One supreme head of the church wrote that the Book of the Romans was translated into Syriac, AD 425, with the help of Pastor Daniel from India. The Syrians in the 5th century in India as well as elsewhere were well trained not only in church services but also in learning, and India was under the Catholic host of Seleucia. Marco Polo, the famous Venetian traveler, speaks of the large island of Socotra in the Arabian Sea near the Gulf of Aden, possessing many baptized Christians who had nothing to do with the Pope at Rome, but were subject to the Catholicos at Baghdad. Some writers find a connection between the island's Christianity and the Abyssinian Church. Of this widespread missionary endeavor, P.Y. Seki writes, "The famous Bar Somas, Bishop of Nisibis, from AD 435 to AD 489, did much to spread the Nestorian teaching in the East, in Central Asia, and then in China." Mingana reveals the civilizing influences of these missions. We need not dwell here on the well-known fact that the Syriac characters, as used by the Nestorians, gave rise to many Central Asian and Far Eastern alphabets, such as the Mongolian, the Manchu, and the Sogdian. These facts reveal that the missionaries of the Church in Asia were the makers of alphabets as well as the creators of a Far Eastern literature. In fact, there still exists a voluminous Syrian church literature which, with research, yields thrilling facts of the past. All directors of ecclesiastical districts were expected to report to headquarters annually. Those from more distant Oriental lands were required to report to the Catholicos not less than once in 6 years. It must have been an astonishing sight to the Persian king to see representatives from so many different countries arriving at Seleucia upon official missions. There are in the writings of Cosmas, the traveling geographer of about AD 530, some thrilling descriptions of Assyrian churches in lands eastward of Persia. Cosmas was of the same church and of the same land as were Pappus and Abba. He lived at the same time as Abba and was a personal friend of the Catholicos. His explorations being in many Asian lands, he has been called Indictopleustes, or India traveler, because of his voyages in the Indian seas early in the 6th century. He believed that the earth was shaped like Moses' tabernacle, and he engaged in research far and wide in studying his thesis. His book, entitled Topographia Christiana, Christian Topography, contains an omnibus collection of remarkable facts, many of which are of real value. From it can be learned how widely extended were the worshippers of the Church of the East. In the 6th century, according to the report of a Nestorian traveler, Christianity was successfully preached to the Bactrians, the Huns, the Persians, the Indians, the Persarmenians, the Medes, the Elamites, the barbaric churches from the Gulf of Persia to the Caspian Sea were almost infinite, and their recent faith was conspicuous in the number and sanctity of their monks and martyrs. The pepper coast of Malabar and the isles of the ocean, Socotra and Ceylon, were people with increasing multitude of Christians, and the bishops and clergy of those sequestered separate regions derived their ordination from the Catholicos of Babylon, or from the head of the church residing at Babylon. Abba comes to the Catholicate. Abba came to the Catholicate after years of confusion caused by the quarrels and laxness due to rival claimants for the position. He was a convert from Zoroastrianism. While still a worshipper of the sun, his learning and ability had advanced him until he was a teacher of the Magi. After his conversion, he studied for a while in the celebrated college of the Assyrian church at Nisibis. Later, he took a voyage farther west to observe the state of Christianity in Syria and Constantinople. Upon his return, he was called to be a teacher in the Christian college at Nisibis. For further incidents of his life, the following excerpts from the splendid work of W.A. Wigram are given. The work of the organization and reform had not been accomplished too soon, for not many weeks can have elapsed since after the Patriarch's return from his tour when his persecution at the hands of the Magi began, a trial that was to continue until his death. Naturally, it was not long before an apostle so conspicuous as the Patriarch was attacked. He being accused to the king by the Mobedian priests in person, and charged with despising the national din, the ruling of Beth Din, or religious court, and with proselytizing. The Patriarch was arrested and tumultuously accused of being an apostate and a proselytizer, both of which charges he fully admitted, and was threatened with death. Abba was given no opportunity to defending himself, but was declared guilty and worthy of death. On this he appealed to the king, who had by this time, for the proceedings took time, returned from the war to Seleucia. Chosroes heard the case, the Mobeds demanding the death of the enemy of the religion, and called on the Patriarch for his answer. His answer, "I am a Christian," he said. "I preach my own faith, and I want every man to join it, but of his own free will and not of compulsion. I use force on no man, but I warn those who are Christians to keep the laws of their religion. And if you would but bear him, sir, you would join us, and we would welcome you," cried a voice from the crowd. It was one Abrudak, a Christian in the king's service, and in the words of course, infuriated the Mobeds, who demanded the death of this blasphemer. Still, a false accuser was found and produced in court, where he broke down utterly and ignominiously, confessing himself that all his accusations were false. Such was an end to such a charge against a man who had done Abba's reforming work, is as high a testimony to the character of the work as could be given. Shortly afterwards, Choros met Abba in the street. The Patriarch was apparently allowed a measure of personal liberty, and to the horror and rage of the Magi, he returned his salute with marked friendliness and summoned him to an audience. Here he told him frankly that, as a renegade, he was legally liable to death. "But you should go free and continue to act as Catholicos if you will stop receiving converts and admit those married by Magian law to communion, and allow your people to eat Magian sacrifices." Obviously, the Mobeds had been influencing the king, but the royal offer sheds an instructive light on the rapid growth of the church, and on the position of the Patriarch as the recognized head of his ministers. To the terms, however, Abba could only return his steadfast non-possums, not possible, and the king, annoyed at this attitude, ordered him to prison under the care of the Magi. This was equivalent to a sentence of death, though it was probably not so intended, for when he was put in prison it would be easy to dispatch him by the hand of some underling, and represent that as an act of possibly mistimed zeal towards a notorious apostate ought not to be judged too severely. Amid the passionate grief of all Christians he departed, and reached the appointed province, but the local jailer, Dardan, a man selected for his notoriously hard character, soon showed such respect and regard for the Patriarch that he was removed thence and sent to Shirsh, the very center of the stronghold of Magianism. Here his confinement was purposely made very severe at first, in the undisguised hopes that his death would be the cause of it, and the hard winters of the high Persian plateau must have been a further trial to one bred in the land of Redden, which is practically the Babylonian plain. Later, however, perhaps in response to a hint from the court, he was allowed to live in a house of his own, where he furnished a room as a church, and his friends were allowed to visit him. Here for 7 years he continued in a captivity which may without interference be compared to that of St. Paul, and acted as a patriarch to it from his prison as in the Magian stronghold. His consecrated bishops reconciled penitents governed by interviews and correspondence. Men came in numbers to see him, and the mountains of the Azerbaijan were worn by the feet of the saints, who came either on church business or on what tended to become a pilgrimage to a living saint. Finally, his persecutors, disappointed no doubt at their failure of their double plan to deprive him of his power or to compass his death, determined to be done with him forever. An assassin was hired, one Peter of Gergon, an apostate Christian priest, and a plot formed for the murder of Abba, who, it was explained, had been cut down in an attempt to making his escape. The plot failed and was discovered, and the wretched instrument, the assassin, fled. Abba, however, recognizing that the attempt would be repeated again, perhaps with better fortune, and took a bold resolution. He left his place of exile with one or two champions, but went not to any place of concealment, but straight to Seleucia and the king, before whose astonished gaze he presented himself. The Magians were, of course, delighted, thinking that their enemy was at last delivered in their hands. The patriarch was, of course, arrested, and the amazed Choros asked what he expected, after thus flying in the face of the royal command. Fearlessly, Mar Abba replied that he was the king's servant, ready to die if that was his will, but though willing to be executed at the king's order, he was not willing to be murdered contrary to his order. Let the king do justice. No appeal so goes home as an oriental cry to the justice of the king. Now he heard the stream of accusations that the Magians poured out, and then addressed the patriarch. You stand charged with apostasy, with proselytizing, and with forcing your ministers to abstain from marriage that the state accepts, with acting as patriarch in exile against the king's order, and with breaking prison, and you admit the offenses. All the offenses against the state I pardon freely. As a renegade from Magianism, however, you must answer the charge before the Mobeds. Now, as you have come of your own accord to the king's justice, go freely to your house, and come to answer the accusation when called upon. The decision shows at once the strength and weakness of the king. He could only pardon offenses against himself, and he could respect a noble character, but he dared not defy the Magian hierarchy. Still, fear of the Mobeds prevailed with the king, and he allowed them to arrest the patriarch and to convey him to prison secretly, for fear of a riot, though it must be owned that he gave strict orders that he was on no account to be killed. For months Abba remained in prison and in chains, though, as it is usual in Oriental prisons, his friends were allowed to visit him, probably by the grace of the great power of Bakish bribery, and he was allowed to even consecrate bishops while in confinement. Still a captive, he was obliged to accompany the king on the whole of his summer progress, though at every halting place Christians crowded to see him and receive his blessing, and to petition the king for his release. Even Mobeds respected him and promised to intercede for his pardon if he would but promise to make no more converts. Finally, soon after the royal return to Seleucia, his patient constancy was victorious. Chosroes sent for him and released him, and absolutely and unconditionally. It is true that when the king left the city, soon after, the Mobeds pounced on their prey, and the patriarch found himself in prison once more. But though Chosroes might hesitate long, he was not the tool the Mobeds imagined him to be, and this open contempt of the royal decree roused him. A sharply worded order for the instant release of the prisoner came back, and Mar Abba, worn in body and broken in health, but victorious, came out once more and finally from his prison. 9 years of persecution and danger had been his portion, but he had endured to the end, and he was saved. Shortly after this, Abba passed away. He is presented as a type of those patriarchs who ruled the Church of the East during the eventful days when the religion of Mithra dominated the thrones of Persia. Abba was called to his heavy task in an hour when the cause needed the hand of a strong leader. From Abba to the Muslim conquest. The individual history of the successors of Abba in the 2 centuries which elapsed between his Catholicate and the overthrow of the Zoroastrian government by the Mohammedans are full of interest. The people who followed the Bible lived on. The hills of Persia and the valleys of the Tigris and the Euphrates re-echoed their songs of praise. They reaped their harvest and paid their tithes, not burdened with the superfluity of observances which obtained with the hierarchy of the West, Roman Catholic rituals, They concentrated their attentions on the word of the Holy Writ. They repaired to their churches on the Sabbath day for the worship of God. In their foreign missionary societies, the youths of the faith offered themselves as ready to go to Turkestan, Scythia, Mongolia, Tibet, Manchuria, China, or wherever God would call. These people, with their simplicity of faith and worship and deep reverence for the Scriptures, with their opposition to images, icons, the confessional, purgatory, the adoration of the host, were the Protestants of Asia. Reformers before the Reformation, they sent gifts and messages of truth and light to the submerged believers in Europe, who during the Dark Ages were praying and dying for the triumph of Bible Christianity. Concerning their missions to Central Asia, India, China, and Japan during the supremacy of the Muslims, the reaction of these eventual hours is reserved for the following chapter. Jacob, the organizer of another Eastern church protesting against the innovations of Rome, was called to be the leader of the Jacobites the same year that Appa was made Catholicos of the Assyrian Christians. The Jacobites constituted a large sector of the dissenting Eastern millions who recoiled from Rome's speculative analysis of the divine nature. Because of the doctrines passed on by the Council of Chalcedon, A.D. 451, the Ethiopian Church, the Coptic Church of Egypt, the Jacobite Church of Syria, and the Church of Armenia broke off all connections with Rome. It is remarkable how these bodies, through the centuries, were kept free from the accumulating beliefs and practices of Rome, which later were rejected by the Reformation. It is true that in spite of the comparative purity of the apostolic faith which they maintained during the supremacy of the papacy, they gave way at times to some papal or heathen practices. Sir E. A. Wallace Budge, in commenting on the controversy between the two natures of Christ, writes, "It is very difficult to find out exactly what the Nestorians thought and said about them, because we have only the statement of his enemies to judge by." The interference of the state in religion had put things in a tension among the Jacobites. Great masses of believers were bitter over the situation in which state-dictated religion had forced them. They were ready for a leader when Jacob Baradai appeared, and he imparted to them an enthusiastic organization which has persisted to this day. The cause of the Jacobites, even that of dissenters in other lands, was made strong by the hands of Jacob Baradai. Edward Gibbon, showing that the preference of the Eastern Church for Turkish rule rather than papal rule, even under dire circumstances, wrote, "After a period of 1300 years and 1360 years, the hostile communions still maintained the faith and discipline of their founders. In the most abject state of ignorance and poverty and servitude, the Nestorians and the Monophysites, another name for the Jacobites, reject the spiritual supremacy of Rome, and cherish the toleration of their Turkish masters." While it would be incorrect to say that the Jacobites and the Church of the East agreed in doctrines, organization, and practices, nevertheless, their differences fundamentally were not great. The Church of the East, growing up in an entirely Oriental environment, never was under Rome. The Monophysites, they believed that Christ had only one nature, godlike. In all their branches, Abyssinians, Copts of Egypt, Jacobites, and Armenians, though citizens of the empire until their break with Rome, early refused to go along with the religion of the Caesars. The believers located in the valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates escaped many of the beliefs and practices which the papacy later adopted. When from about AD 650 both bodies passed more or less under the Mohammedan rulers, their afflictions were less severe than those experienced by evangelicals in the Gothic 10 kingdoms of Western Europe, when brought under the papal rule. Assyrian Christians and Jacobites suffered comparatively little at the hands of the Muslims, but later much more so at the hands of the Jesuits. These later afflictions had a tendency to draw them together. As an illustration, witness the Assyrian Christians of India, when the devastating persecutions of the Jesuits had laid them low, accepting the leadership of a Monophysite bishop who happened at the moment to arrive at the Malabar coast. There have been already noticed in many detail many fundamental differences between these two bodies on the one hand and the Church of the Empire on the other. In the further history of the expansion of the Assyrian Church during the Muslim rule in Persia, Authorities will be cited as evidence that the Sabbath of the Fourth Commandment was observed both by the Monophysitism and the Church of the East in their separate areas in Near and Far Asia. Rise and conquest of the Mohammedans. Like the smoke out of the bottomless pit, darkening the sun and the air, the new religion of Muhammad issued suddenly from Arabia. Like a whirlwind from the desert, it swept furiously over the rivers and plains until all of Western Asia, Northern Africa, and the southern extremities of Europe had been conquered. Three factors contributed to the sudden and amazing conquest of the Arabians. First was the new national awakening among the Arabs. The second was the exhaustion of Roman and Persian empires caused by 4 centuries of constant warfare between themselves, plus the gigantic invasions of the Goths, which had overrun the western provinces of Rome. The third was Muhammad himself. In the days of Abba and his successors, new movements were stirring the Arabians. They were throwing off their old idolatry and longing for a monotheistic religion like the Jews and other powerful neighbors. They had a strong urge towards national unity. Several forays accompanied by success had convinced them of the weakness of both the Roman and Persian empires. All they needed was a leader, and the leader was Muhammad. Of course, it took some time for this obscure camel driver to convince his fellow countrymen of his pretended revelation from heaven, that there is but one God, and Muhammad is his prophet. Born about 570 at Mecca, he arose from an ordinary laborer until he married a wealthy widow in whose employ he was. With deepening religious fervor, he began to see visions and to dream dreams, but for some time his success was limited to converting his immediate relatives and servants. His growing progress excited the hostility of Mecca. So, when, about the year of AD 622, he fled with his most trusted companions to the city of Medina, where he was received as a prophet, this flight, the Hegira, was chosen as the first year of Mohammedan era. This new prophet and his belligerent disciples began attacking rich caravans. Strengthened by the riches and the arms of their plunder, they began the subjugation of Arabia, which was accomplished by the time of the death of Muhammad. Under impetuosity, his immediate successors, Abu Bakr, Omar, and Uthman, it was not long before Syria, Egypt, and Persia were subdued. When the Arabian Empire was fully established, it built up Baghdad, its magnificent new capital. The Church of the East, still recognizing the importance of having its headquarters at the center of a secular government, removed its spiritual capital from Seleucia to Baghdad, where it remained approximately for the next 500 years. Nevertheless, great conquests for God were accomplished by the Church of the East, while Mohammedanism reigned in all lands stretching towards the Pacific. This will be the theme in the succeeding chapters.